I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you here for this session on the peace and conflict potential of the green transition. I think we've heard a fair amount about this morning, and I think all of you are bringing your expertise to this room, so I won't do too much of an introduction here, but just to mention that we understand that the transition to a renewable energy economy is going to put pressure on countries whose GDP is reliant on fossil fuels. There's a lot of barriers to overcome for countries who are still experiencing pretty severe energy deficits. And there's also an opportunity for those countries who have, for example, are mineral producing countries and can contribute the minerals and raw materials needed to power the renewable energy transition, but ensuring that we do this in a way that is a marked difference from how it's been done in the past is going to be very important. Also thinking about the broader context in which the renewable energy transition is taking place, right? So we have countries are simultaneously dealing with the impacts of climate change, as we have seen in the US in just the last week, as well as many other parts of the world, where critical infrastructure is being wiped out and putting pressure on communities. We have severe conflicts taking place in a number of regions around the world, rising authoritarianism and populism, including backlash against the very efforts needed to undergird the energy transition, and rising misinformation and disinformation complicating these efforts. We also have a global population that is at an unprecedented moment, right? We have passed 8 billion. We're on our way to, I think, 10.3 billion. But a lot of that growth is taking place in parts of the world that have an energy deficit, that don't have the access to energy that they need. We have an aging US, aging Europe, aging Asia, including China. And so what this means for the global economy and for peace and stability is another aspect of the conversation that I think is important for this one. So we know that we need to proceed with our eyes wide open, that there is an opportunity to bolster peace through the energy transition, but that investments and policies need to take into account all of these various risks and be responsive to the needs of communities and countries. So the focus of this conversation is how to do that. So I'm going to put our three panelists up here on the spot to kick us off, and then we'll go ahead and open the conversation. And I think we have about 49 minutes. We're going to start with by hearing from Andrew Hyde, who is the Director and Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center on the Transforming Conflict and Governance Program, where he leads on projects covering UN peacekeeping and UN financing. Prior to his role at Stimson, Andrew served for 3 decades as a career U.S. Foreign Service officer and worked extensively on multilateral diplomacy at the global and regional levels. He's also worked in the U.S. Congress in both the House and Senate, so brings a lot of really important expertise and experience to this conversation. Next, we'll hear from Chiara Buzzico, who's currently a senior energy advisor within Mercy Corps' Technical Research and Quality Team. Her expertise looks across renewable energy, humanitarian energy access, and the water energy food nexus. She has a background in energy engineering and a specialization in renewable energy finance and international cooperation, as well as bringing expertise from both the NGO and private sectors to this conversation. And then we will finally hear from Ibrahim Wambai, who is a geologist with a strong focus on medical geology, which I would like to hear more about at some point, exploring how environmental elements interact with human health and public health systems. And just last year, he joined Clean Technology Hub as the lead of the Climate, Conflict, and Fragility Portfolio, where he oversees projects and advocacy efforts centered on public health, forced migration, and livelihood diversification. He's working to engage stakeholders to amplify Nigeria's climate action plan. So let's go ahead and get started. Andrew, I'm going to start with you, and if you could talk about, from your perspective, where you're seeing the energy transition exacerbate or spark tensions and risks, but also opportunities to bolster peace and security, and are there specific examples that you can point to?
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to join you. I'm going to commit maybe the cardinal sin here and sort of try to be telegraphic almost, just some bullet points that I want to share with you on the work we've done. in the interest of time, in the interest of getting into the discussion. But clearly what we've heard this morning, and I think everyone in this room appreciates, is that the green transition has an enormous impact on wealth and economic power in conflict-prone regions. But that's not the only thing. It's just the fact that if there is a dependence on fossil fuels, that is also a contributor to conflict, driver of conflict in many ways. Least of all, or not least of all, really is supply chains, diesel supply chains, as much electric power is generated by diesel generators. When you're running diesel supply chains through conflict-prone areas, that is a contributor to conflict. Renewable energy can be an answer to that by removing those supply chains or sharply reducing them, and it can also diversify energy sources and increase access to energy for a wider share of the population, and that contributes to peace. Our focus in our research at the Stimson Center has been really anchored, has looked at this general idea, but has been anchored in UN operations, particularly peacekeeping. Because peacekeeping operations, particularly the largest peacekeeping peace operations in sub-Saharan Africa, use substantial amounts of energy. In some cases, a UN peace operation consumes 20% of the electricity of the entire country. That tells you about the scale of the UN operation. It also tells you about the low energy access in those countries. But by shifting from diesel to renewable energy, those peace operations can in fact contribute to their underlying mission of bringing peace to conflict-prone areas. An example of our research has been in Somalia, where we've seen that the increase of solar and wind capacity has both expanded energy access and reduced costs for accessing that electricity. And that has in turn contributed to economic development and peace and reduced conflict. Now, it's going to sound like I'm imitating the foreign minister this morning, but we actually developed a couple of years ago a Powering Peace Index, as we call it. It's on our website. It looks at some of the same data sources that the German index does, but it also takes into account energy access. And not surprisingly, there are some degrees of factor associations, affiliations between low energy access, proneness to conflict, if you will, and economic development. And so if we can tackle some of those, we can improve all of those factors. I think finally, I just look ahead in terms of the work we're doing. COP28 was last year, really sort of established, I think, the idea of having a recovery, relief, and peace day as part of the climate discussion, so important. And 93 countries signed an agreement to triple their renewable energy capacity in the next 6 or 7 years. But unfortunately, in the declaration in general on recovery and peace, there was not a specific reference to renewable energy. So we have an opportunity at COP29, and we're going to be pursuing it, to leverage global momentum around a climate solution and advance peace and development goals in the least electrified countries in the world that also happen to be the most conflict prone. I'll leave it there at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for abiding by our rules. You set a great precedent for everybody in the room. Okay, Chiara, next over to you. Mercy Corps does an amazing work in sort of conflict-affected regions in terms of peace building and providing access to energy. So walk us through what that looks like in your portfolio.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Your microphone.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I have to turn it on. Can you hear me? Yeah. So Mercy Corps is a humanitarian organization. We work in plus 40 countries across the globe, and indeed, like climate change is a big issue that we are facing. In 2021, we decided to narrow down a little bit our global strategy, which indeed recognized the nexus between conflict and climate change as the two main drivers for crisis. And this came as a natural consequence of the crescent need to address the complexity of a humanitarian response in contexts and situations that are increasingly affected by climate-related shocks. When looking at the nexus between conflicts and climate change, I think it's important to recognize all the different nuances of this nexus. On one side, for sure, climate change is a threat per se. It increases the competition over natural resources. It increases the demand for complementary resources, such as energy access, for example. And it brings negative impact to the global economy. We have been seeing that for each single degree of global temperature raise correspond about 12% of reduction of the global GDP. But it's also important to recognize that these impacts are not evenly distributed across the community, but are likely to affect more negatively the already most vulnerable segments of communities, such as women, youth, and last but not least, displaced population. Moreover, we have to recognize that climate change also amplify existing inequalities from a social and economical perspective, and therefore hits even worse in contexts that are already affected by conflicts. We have seen through our experience that about 1/3 of the conflicts that broke out between the 1980 and the 2016 were actually preceded by climate-related shocks, and this is a huge evidence of how much actually climate change can lead to conflict. But at the same time, we do see that the effects of this climate change are definitely worse where there are already inequalities brought by conflicts. Within this overall framework, the energy transition, and so the access to renewable, affordable, and reliable energy comes within the strategy with a twofold perspective. On one side, we do support communities to cope, adapt to emergencies, even like driven by conflicts or climate-related shocks, by leveraging the power of renewables. And it is important to think about the role of renewables in contexts that are affected by crisis by thinking them as both mitigation and adaptation means. Mitigation because let's think about contexts that are affected by climate change shocks and the importance of having reliable energy to mitigate the effects of these shocks, but at the same time adaptation because access to energy, to affordable and reliable energy is key for the recovery after the emergency. At the same time, we do so with the increasing commitment to reduce the environmental footprint of our own operations. As you correctly said, the humanitarian operations, not only the UN operations, lead to very relevant amount of CO2 emissions and are also associated to very high costs. Very often we are asked, okay, but why, if there is like a funding shortage already, should we focus on the green transition of humanitarian operations instead of focusing on programs themselves? And the reason is that because actually, like beyond the environmental benefit of the green transition for humanitarian operations, there is an economical, financial benefit which must be considered. Like our environmental commitment from this point of view is put in practice from an operational perspective, but also in our own interventions. I have a few examples that I could provide, but I would maybe stop here, and I'll be happy to give some more background later on.
Why don't you give one quick example? Sorry.
One quick example, yeah. So I think that the most effective example that showcase the adaptation and mitigation side of renewable energy is the Caribbean Resilience Initiative, which is a program that Mercy Corps is implementing in 5 countries in the Caribbean region, aiming at supporting communities to in the disaster risk reduction phase, but also to respond and recover from the emergency. And we do so by providing access to renewable energy, considering that these countries are countries that are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, are not producers of fossil fuels, meaning that they are heavily dependent on imports, and all the supply chain around the electricity generation during the climate emergency is really, really compromised. So in this case, we can definitely see the double benefit of renewable energy, enabling the response and the recovery phase, but also mitigating interventions that otherwise would be massively reliant on fossil fuels.
Thank you, Chiara. Ibrahim, over to you, and can you talk to us about what this looks like in the context of Nigeria? I'm not turning this off, it's just doing it on its own. What it looks like in the context of Nigeria, and what efforts your organization is making to bring these issues together.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, good afternoon. I just checked the time is past 12 now. I'm Ibrahim Wambay from Nigeria, working with Clean Technology Hub, a small organization trying to make impact. The fact, I'm hoping that everyone here will agree, is that access to energy is a de facto basic human right. And I hope that we can all formally agree that that is so. But for us in our context, before providing energy, you are looking at what people are majorly faced with first. And we look at insecurity. The insecurities in Nigeria are divergent. We have banditry, we have insurgency, we have terrorism, you know, and all that. Now, local communities are looking just to survive firsthand. And they are only able to do that if their livelihoods are sustained. Now, with the advent of climate change, they have, especially, say, in the northern part of the country, they've had a transgenerational agricultural calendar. Now, those things don't work for them anymore. The government used to have agricultural extension work where synthesized data from the meteorological agency and the likes is being pushed down to farmers to say, this is what you must do. But that's not happening anymore. It has become expensive, and the regions have become insecure for these people to go in. Somebody rightly said somewhere that however remote a place is in the world, you find a worship center, be it a mosque, church, synagogue, temple, you know. So we looked at that angle to see that we can use traditional and religious institutions to do the advocacy. So we had an inaugural Climate and Fragility Summit back in late July, 31st of July. We brought together religious leaders, traditional leaders, academia, and critical stakeholders. We brought them together and all outlined that the problem is about reach, the problem is about knowledge, the problem is about building early warning. And so our early warning mechanism is to go through these religious and traditional leaders to preach this gospel to them. Of course, it's new. And of course, you know, the terrain is quite different, but in Africa, it's not an easy cinch going on the street to ask somebody about climate change. You know, for them, it's just a farce. You know, they don't really believe in it. But those that are largely affected see the impacts of what's happening to them, but they can't really tell you exactly what's happening. So we're trying to use these mediums to go and down into the most vulnerable communities to start building resilience first to their livelihood, because I don't know if it's an African adage that a hungry man is an angry man. So if they are hungry, of course, nothing really goes into their head. So we are trying to give them solace by maintaining, giving them capacity to be able to maintain their livelihoods, you know, before we start talking about energy. And with energy, what we are looking at is productive use energy. So we've been working with mini-grid developers and so far, the last discussion we had with the developers, none of them have really recorded any financial gain yet. Because we realize again that they power their homes, you know, these developers go give them energy, but these energies are powering their homes. So we're now redirecting, you know, how the energy is being used to productive use. You know, small implements, farm implements, also giving them opportunity to have a value chain addition in the things they do. You know, small refinements, small scale processing, you know, just so that they are also having economic gains, and then the mini-grid developers can also, you know, now be paid remuneration for the energy they have been providing. I think this is just a basic overview of what we've been able to achieve. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. It's interesting to hear about your engagement with traditional and religious leaders as sort of an entry point into having that community engagement. Okay, so from here, I'm going to open the floor, and I welcome any additions to the conversation, whether it's a comment or experience from your own work, or a question that you want to pose to the room. For those of you sitting around the edges, I'm going to apologize. You'll have to come and lean over somebody and speak into their mic. I'm willing to share. Okay, please, go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead and turn it on, and if you'll just introduce yourself briefly, too.
Hi, my name's Natalia. I work at Safer World, which is a peace-building organization. Thank you for the presentations. It's really great to, I think that articulation and understanding of the linkages and opportunities in relation to green transition and peace and conflict is extremely important. And it seems quite auspicious that November the 15th, I think there will be both an energy and the Peace Day. And so I wonder if that might provide further opportunities to link these together more at COP29. For example, I know there's been some work going on around common principles for effective climate finance and how to translate the declaration, looking at the how of the declaration. These are great commitments, but how do we implement them? And so I wondered from the panel if there are further examples of what you'd like to see come out of things like the COP29 negotiations in terms of concrete action to link all of these different opportunities. Thanks.
Thank you. Please. I'm sorry? Yeah, let's take a couple, but then I want to say that was a great question, and anybody in the room is welcome to answer it.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Tobias Ide. I'm professor at Murdoch University in Australia and also at Hiroshima University in Japan. And I'm broadly concerned with three conflict aspects of the green energy transition, and especially those of you who work on the ground on the topic. I would like to hear insights on your solution to that. Very briefly, the first one is how do we make sure that large-scale or medium-scale renewable energy projects do not lead to violence-resistant contestation and state repression, and we see that happening in quite a few countries. The second thing is how do we make sure that the minerals we need for renewable energies are mined in a conflict-sensitive way that do not lead to local exploitation and conflict. And the third one is what do we do with countries that will need to move away from financing their state budgets and welfare systems by hydrocarbons, especially as we know that countries like Venezuela or Iraq have already delved into instability due to a loss of hydrocarbon revenues.
Thanks, Tobias, for those three easy questions that you added. Okay, so four questions. So thinking about the ahead to COP and this recognition of energy and peace and the nexus and the declaration, what can be done sort of by, I would say, like, not by a particular sector, right? Sort of looking across sectors, where are there opportunities for entry points to build those bridges? And then Tobias about the large-scale energy projects and avoiding conflicts around those, the minerals, and then the countries that are reliant on fossil fuels. I have a couple things to say, but I'm going to keep it open first, please.
Hi, I'm Nazanin Mashiri from International Crisis Group.
Could you speak into a mic just so that those watching on... It's just for those watching online. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Hi, Nazanin Mashiri from International Crisis Group. So in the past year, we've seen a real downturn in oil output in Africa for various reasons, conflict, economic, etc. Climate activists would say, actually, that's a really good thing, but Africa needs to be able to pay for the energy transition. How is it going to do that with the gaps growing in terms of the financing it needs and the oil output going down? So I'd like to know from the panelists, how this is going to impact what we're talking about, which is energy transition, a just transition, but someone's got to pay for it.
Right. Yeah, no, that ties into Tobias's question, I think, about the countries who are reliant on fossil fuels. And Ibrahim, maybe we can start with you, given Nigeria.
Yeah, Nigeria is actually, in this very tight mix. So the question has been about transparency for us. And I think I wrote something down here. Let's see if you pardon me to just read through. I said transparency is the bedrock of any truly sustainable transition to clean energy. If we are serious about sustainability, the process must be clean in its entirety, morally, socially, financially, and developmentally. The exploration of transition minerals must be just and clean as the energy they promise to deliver. In the oil fields in Nigeria, we still have huge problems of land reclamation not being done. And it falls back to the issue I started with about people's livelihoods being seized. In those communities, somewhat of no livelihood supporting kind of activity can happen. The waters are gone, the fisheries are gone, the soil is gone. Nothing can happen there. And what we are looking at now, the problems of the oil exploration still exist. And because we still have minerals, transition minerals, again in some parts of the country, we're looking at building confidence first. So it's about transparency in and out. Yeah, sometimes the government can be tricky, and as I speak, we're having huge problems around fuel prices and all that. Nigerians can't understand why we have this resource and we're still having to pay so hugely for PMS. But transparency for me is what will win the day. Because, yeah, she said, who is going to pay for it? If they have been transparent, from within and outside, for me, I think it's easily done. If you are saving up or investing more in technologies that will ensure a smooth and easy transition, we are phasing out oils. You already have huge revenues from there. You are investing in, renewable and safe and clean energy solutions and technologies. It's easy over time, to just swiftly go from, the bad energy to the, good one. Again, owing to the fact that we have reserves of some of these transition minerals. But what's happening now, again, and we're trying to go into a dialogue with those that matter, just so that we are not plunged deeper into the same disaster. There's a community in Nasarawa State, not far from the federal capital. They have reserves of lithium. Artisanal mining that's done there now is so blocked out in a way that nobody knows what's happening. And we're beginning to have some of these social, political issues arising from, those regions, because we find young girls of 10, 11, 12 years getting pregnant because of the boys that are tasked to do the artisanal mining, have been given so much money to keep quiet and not say anything to anyone. And then, because of that huge influx, women, of course, who are mostly challenged financially, sometimes without, prior knowledge, daughters, go out and, get monies from these people and, maybe end up getting pregnant. So some of social issues and political issues arising. So for me, it's just an issue of transparency. If everybody can, come together and say, you're a foreign investor, you want to be plain. You want to have access to these minerals. Let it be clean, let it be open. I think for me that is one way we can go about it.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I think it's an important point about the social impacts, right, and how we see these issues play out, because that's also another entry point for responses that can strengthen communities, right? So thinking about how do we make sure we're sending girls to school and not to mines.
Yes.
Coming back to the sort of thinking about projects and maybe the minerals piece, there's a book by Peter Schwartzstein that's out about climate and the fury, and he walks through about over a decade of reporting on climate security in the Middle East and North Africa, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia as well. There's like a number of different cases that he walks through, and it does a really nice job of articulating just how pervasive climate insecurity is and how it eats away at the social fabric, and also the relationship between states and societies. And I think coming back to you, Chiara, I mean, Mercy Corps' work has really been about that sort of that relationship between the state and society, and how do you strengthen community resilience. And one of the things that he talks about is this sort of dependency on big projects, right? Big projects are sexy, and they mean a lot of financing, and there's a lot of winners, right, that come out when you have, well, potentially when you have some big projects, but there's also potentially a lot of losers, and a lot of these big projects are not actually climate proof. So we think about they're supposed to last for decades, and they can't, right? So I wonder if you, bringing it back to that subnational level and thinking about what are the kinds of investments that can be most effective, that are like sort of decentralized, right? Like how do we build up decentralized approaches that are really incorporating recognition of the risks that are being experienced by a particular community in a particular context? Like how can external actors and folks outside be partners with countries and communities to advance those kinds of efforts?
No, thank you for the question. And I would start by saying something that is also related to the question of who is going to pay for that. I think that when speaking about humanitarian settings, we have to keep in mind that like numbers are huge. 700,000 people without access to electricity, a couple of billion people without access to clean cooking. We are used to forget about clean cooking, but clean cooking emissions are of the same scale of the emissions produced by the aviation sector. So we should keep it really, really in mind. Which means that while on the other side, the traditional humanitarian approach has been characterized for years by in-kind distributions and in-kind approaches. Well, we do believe that it's going to be impossible to address these huge needs by keeping relying on such a traditional approach. And we really need to shift towards more long-term solutions that, based on our approach and our experience, really see the cooperation of different actors within the design of the interventions. Most of our, of course, like the right answer would be depends. It depends on the specific context that we are looking at, and like the localization and the analysis of the local context is a building block of an effective program. But overall, I would say that except for the very first emergency response, the approaches that we tend to prioritize are market-based approaches, where instead of providing directly aid to the communities, we try to address the barriers preventing the private sector, for example, from providing those services to the most vulnerable segments of communities. This definitely helps in achieving larger scales, and also pass through the active involvement of communities. And when I say communities, I don't only refer to the final users of the energy technologies and services that we try to foster access to, but also governments, for example, private sector and the local civil society. So I would say, like in short, strengthening the localization which is like sometimes a very like abused word, but like effectively fostering localization, making like I think that is very important while designing a program and implementing a program to start looking beyond the implementation period. The programs like are supposed to continue after the implementation period, and this is something that we have to keep in mind since the analysis of the problem that we are trying to address. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Andrew, do you want to chime in based on sort of the experience that you've had working in sort of multilateral and UN peacekeeping efforts?
Yeah, I think Kara made a very good point about localization, and that's critically important. But the role, as I mentioned earlier, about international actors is obviously can be important both for propelling it forward and for getting the necessary financing. And financing, I don't necessarily mean by just providing funds. But I think in terms of UN peacekeeping operations, humanitarian operations, you have potentially an anchor customer who is willing to pay and consistently pay most of the time, rates for renewable energy, but if they insist on renewable energy that then can be a platform for investment and providing it to the larger community, perhaps at a lower rate or a subsidized rate. So I think that the international presence can really help in a lot of communities, in a lot of countries, conflict-prone countries. I want to just run back to a couple of the questions that came up on the COP. I mentioned this briefly when I started. I think that the key really from COP 28 to 29 is to draw the line more directly in the outcome of the COP, in some of the outcome documents, from renewable energy to climate change. There was a lot of discussion of climate change, some discussion last year on renewable energy, but the two weren't really brought together, and I think that in doing that, we can make the opening for conflict and fragility in that case. Secondly, you mentioned earlier about scale of power, and I think that's one thing that we've certainly in our research discovered, that smaller can be better, that you can diversify power sources. It makes it less vulnerable, fewer points of failure for the whole system. So one of the things we've started to really promote more is diversified power sources. And that's more complicated for an electric grid, but I think ultimately it gives you a more durable power system. And then in terms of state dependency on hydrocarbons and energy production, and I want to again kind of touch on what my colleague said, I've got sort of two almost contradictory thoughts on this. One is that you really do need to involve incumbent actors to some extent because they are the ones that have the influence, the power, the interest. But at the same time, I think it's very important, and we've seen this in a lot of communities where we've been doing our research in the Central African Republic and South Sudan and other countries. You need to empower entrepreneurs to provide power, and this gets back to the smaller scale potentially. But if you can empower entrepreneurs both for financing, for development, and one way of doing that is through power purchase agreements where you really make a commitment to buy a certain amount of energy from an investor, from somebody who's developing it. We've had some cases of international actors, international companies that come in and do this, and they do one of these build, operate, and transfer models where they go ahead and build it on their own dime. They operate it, they get money, they get revenues from international actors and others over a period of time, and then they turn it over to local actors at that point, and they walk away, frankly, from it. So I think that's also a very promising model. So there's a lot of examples out there, not just theoretical, but really evidence that we've uncovered in our research on this that I think would serve as a good lesson in this area. Thank you.
Lauren, can I add a point on this? Because like you, Ibrahim, touched upon a very interesting point in my opinion, and is the fact that we need to look beyond the provision of energy as a service or as a technology, right? But we need to make sure, especially once again in humanitarian settings, that increased energy access is actually leveraged to create economic opportunities, which are the economic opportunities that then enable people in paying for that technology and then enable the private sector to keep providing that technology after the implementation period. So like the so-called integrated approaches, for example, the energy food nexus, are really, really key to not to stop with the delivery of energy as a technology, which is an approach that has, I would say, more limitation than actually benefit.
Great, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much for your inputs. My name is Michelle. I'm part of a youth group working on climate and foreign policy, and I want to talk about the aspect of just transition instead of just green transition, because I really think if the green transition isn't just, it will rather contribute to conflict instead of peace. And that also means that the same extractive model of resource exploitation that we've been seeing from the global south to the global north will perpetuate and even increase conflicts in the future. And so I think also like to answer your second question, I think if the just transition isn't going to benefit those who are around these renewable energy projects, who are around hydrogen projects, and we've been seeing that already in terms of solar panels that are being built, but they are not benefiting the local communities, that will not contribute to a peaceful placement of these aspects. If it's not safeguarding human rights, also in their supply chains, and we see that in the DRC, we see where a lot of lithium is mined for the renewable transition here in the global north, it will contribute to conflict. If it's not done with pre and prior consent by indigenous communities, where these resources are taken from, where the land is taken from, it will contribute to conflict. And if it's not done with youth and also women and indigenous communities on the table, because it's also about their aspect and understanding of a just transition, these actors have been continuously also talked about a care economy, for instance, and I think we really need to think also about these transitions of the model. And lastly, I want to say that I do think that there's opportunities, for instance, through the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It does not only address the move away and the stop of the extraction of fossil fuels, but also how a just transition can look like. And I think if we also advocate then how a just transition can be done in a gender-sensitive but also conflict-sensitive manner towards a care economy, that can very much, a contract like that that's outside of the COP space can very much contribute. And we've seen Colombia, for instance, and many others, forwarding this treaty. So I would also really like to hear your opinions on what kind of mechanisms are out there and where do you see potential?
That's great, thank you. And very important and good reminder that a just energy transition is critical to a conflict-sensitive renewable energy transition. So thank you very much for that. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Olivier Schott, Principal Administrator at the European Commission in Brussels, Director General for Climate Action. I'm going to be telegraphic for the sake of timing. Two questions to the panel. The first on the role of carbon markets and carbon pricing to ensure a peaceful green transition or not. Second question, the global pledge on renewables and energy efficiency at COP20, we're still missing more than 60 countries. How can we encourage them to sign up? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat that last one again?
The second question is on the global renewables pledge.
Okay.
We have more than 60 countries that haven't signed up to. How can we encourage them to do so? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if, there's the point about the just energy transition and how do we ensure that efforts are inclusive of traditionally marginalized communities, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's the only way forward, really. And then the role of carbon markets and the global renewable pledge. I'm gonna, thank you, we have 10 minutes left. This is a roundtable, so I will invite my colleagues up here to respond, but I also wanna make sure that it's open to the room because I know there's a lot of expertise here. I wanna ask, is anybody in this room with the private sector? So like that is one thing that I think is a problem and something that I've been grappling with because we do engage the private sector in our work at the Wilson Center, but we speak a different language. And I've been trying to learn their language. I'm like relying on AI at this point because it is really complicated. But I think that's one point here, is especially when we're talking about energy markets and carbon markets and everything. This is an important dimension of the conversation that we as a community could do better, I think. Okay, does anybody from the outside of this front of the room want to respond to any of the questions that have been raised? Okay, then I turn it over. Oh, sorry, please. Oh, please do, come up to the mic.
Thank you. It's less an answer than a comment or an addition to what Michel also said. I'm Caroline Kruke, working for Bread for the World in the Working Group on Peace and Development, Freehand, here in Germany. I really like very much, Michel, what you said, to point to the just transition, which I think is key for the whole discussion. On the one side, because we must not repeat the same mistakes that we did from the fossil fuel energy sector. We know that many issues are in the regenerative energies ask for land, so all these investments are land-based. And we know that the land rights issue is really critical, land and water, you mentioned that as well, for the livelihoods. And there are lots of guidelines out in the air already. Yeah, the UN voluntary guidelines on land, forests, and fisheries is one of the voluntary guidelines that also the private sector has to look into it and follow, but also states and NGOs. There are also the UN principles on business and human rights in conflict-affected regions, which I think we have to remind us to draw on those guidelines and declarations and principles that are there, and the ILO Convention 169, where IPs have the right to free, prior, informed consent. All these guidelines are often neglected and not followed, also in the regenerative energy sector, how far I can observe it. And I want us to remind us that these guidelines exist, one, in combination with conflict sensitivity. And the other one, I think what was not mentioned yet, is that we all have to do our work at home. We have to reduce our own energy consumption. Yeah. Otherwise, the just transition cannot take place elsewhere.
Thank you. It's a good point that a lot of the work has been done and can be more effectively leveraged. It just requires having the conversations over and over and over again. And that can be frustrating, but I think is really important. Okay, so I think we only have a few more minutes left. So I'm gonna go down and invite responses to the questions that have been raised and comments that have been shared, and then any final thoughts and something that you might take away from this discussion. Tobias, what do you have? Is it burning?
It's not burning.
So okay. No, please, go ahead. No, it's fine, please.
Okay, I will be really quick. I'm just sharing one of the concerns I have, especially connected to yours and your presentation, your remarks. And one of the questions is that if we want to avoid the worst implications of climate change, we need to act really fast.
The urgency, yeah.
And on a really large scale. And my concern is that, and indicated by the business sector not in the room, that having these transitions about justice, participation, degrowth might take another couple of years to be at a level where we are confident that they will go forward as they should go forward. But we don't have that time in the climate action space. I see not everyone agrees, but I think realistically we are not there yet, and I think unfortunately it will take more time. So I'm really concerned there might be really uncomfortable trade-offs, despite all the promising approaches in terms of small-scale energy production. But again, the minerals for those need to come off somewhere. So I'm just concerned there might be hard trade-offs. I personally would be very, very uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I'll just make a plug. Next Friday, the Wilson Center, we're hosting with the White House and USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, a forum on inclusive climate action, which is another way of saying climate equity, that I would encourage you to tune into. And we've done a fair amount of work on the mineral space too, thinking about what it looks like in the context of a just energy transition. And it is we don't have enough time here, but I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. And I would encourage you all. There's been a fair amount of space in that, so we can continue the conversation over lunch. Okay, 3 minutes.
Sorry, just to respond to what Tobias said, that large scale, if I get you right, the minerals have to come in quick. Is that?
Yes.
So this is the problem. From a geologic perspective, I stand to be corrected. I don't know if there's a technology thus far that will extract minerals in a safe enough way that is not affecting the environment. And now you talked about the interest in biogeochemical cycle. Geology is regional. Water being a universal solvent, it takes away a part of anything it touches. So large-scale mining only leads us back to the problem of livelihoods from that perspective. Responding to the global pledges, again, this is the issue of geopolitical shifts. People who are countries who rely solely on, say, fossil fuels may not be willing to go into pledges like that for now, for maybe austerity or face saving, because the eminent reality is they need to keep going, you know. And if the targets are too quick to be acceptable in their economics or in their plans, definitely I think it's only natural that there will be hesitance to, you know, enter into those pledges. I think those are my responses for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Please. Chiara.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go very, very quick on the question on the carbon finance. So, like, within the humanitarian space, blended finance, I mean, it's not a secret that there is a financial gap when it comes to the financial sustainability of energy businesses in those contexts. So blended finance play a key role, and carbon finance within the sphere of blended finance does play an important role. For us, specifically when it comes to clean cooking, much more than when it comes to access to electricity, for a bunch of reasons that, I mean, I won't speak about now, but happy to maybe discuss it further later. So much easier to work to include carbon finance into the interventions when it comes to clean cooking than electricity, but definitely like do play a role. Yeah.
And just really briefly, I want to address two comments that came up here. I said earlier, I think that the just energy transition in some ways takes place when you bring the energy, electricity generation closer to people. That doesn't necessarily mean it's at small scale. I think there's a way you can do that at a large scale. But if you have individual home-based renewable energy or community-based solar energy, I think that leads to a more just transition. There are obviously other factors, but I would say that's an important, necessary factor. Thank you.
And very quick on this note, the decentralization of energy generation play actually also a key role in mitigating the effects of conflicts. So we have been seeing how much electricity infrastructure has been targeted during the like current conflicts. So decentralizing the generation of energy also plays a role in this regard.
Well, that's time. This felt like a sprint. All of the questions and comments could have been addressed in their own entire panel conversation. But thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for bringing the important dimensions of the discussion to the table. And please enjoy your lunch, and thank you to my panelists up here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.